Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our event, The State of the Presidential Election, with our very special guest, Amy Walter. Our program this evening is the fourth of a fall series of programs at St. Olaf College on the topic of the presidential election in a nation in crisis, polarization, pandemic, prejudice. My name is Edmund Santuri. I'm a professor at St. Olaf College and Morrison Family Director of the college's Institute for Freedom and Community, the institute sponsoring tonight's event and the fall series just mentioned. The purpose of St. Olaf's Institute for Freedom and Community is to stimulate and support free inquiry and meaningful debate of important political and social issues among students, faculty, staff, and the larger public. By exploring diverse ideas about politics, markets, and society, the Institute aims to challenge presuppositions, question easy or comfortable answers, and foster constructive civil dialogue among those with differing values and contending points of view. For help in organizing our event tonight, special thanks go to Institute Assistant Director Eric Grell and Institute Student Assistant Jess Horst. Thanks also to Jeff O'Donnell, Joshua Wyatt, and the St. Olaf Broadcast Media Services crew, to Andrea Galswick, Dan Hollering, and Carrie Vanderveen of St. Olaf Marketing and Communications, and to Sarah Swenson and Madeline Rush of Goff Public. Finally, thanks to St. Olaf College faculty and students who have integrated their study with our program this evening, particularly participants in the Public Affairs Conversation program supported by the Institute, taught by Jason Marsh and Brendan Wessler, and political science courses on parties and elections, taught by Christopher Chapp, and populism, democracy, and world politics, taught by Douglas Casson. To remind our virtual audience members, you are invited to submit a question at any point during the discussion this evening by using the Participate tab on the streaming page. We are honored to have with us tonight Amy Walter, National Editor of the Cook Political Report and host of WNYC's The Takeaway Fridays, heard on National Public Radio news stations. For more than 20 years, Amy Walter has built a reputation as an accurate, objective, and insightful political analyst with unparalleled access to campaign insiders and decision makers. Known as one of the best political journalists covering Washington, she is national editor of the nonpartisan Cook Political Report and a frequent on-air analyst. In addition to her weekly appearance on the popular Politics Monday segment of the PBS NewsHour, Amy also hosts WNYC's nationally syndicated public radio news program, Politics with Amy Walter, on The Takeaway. She is, in addition, a regular Sunday panelist on NBC's Meet the Press, CBS's Face the Nation, and appears frequently on Special Report with Bret Baier of Fox News. She is the former political director of ABC News. Named one of the top 50 journalists by Washingtonian Magazine, Walter was dubbed one of the most powerful people in politics in George Magazine for her insights into the mechanics that make the political machine run. Amy Walter, welcome. We are so pleased to have you with us this evening.
Oh, thank you so much, Ed. I'm just sorry that I couldn't be there in person. I also, one thing not read, but one of the things I'm most proud of on my resume is also being a small liberal arts college graduate.
Terrific.
And so I'm a Colby College graduate, and I am a big advocate and evangelist for the liberal arts, and especially small liberal arts colleges. So it gives me great pleasure to be able to, again, even though I'm not on campus, to be able to speak to this community.
Yeah, we're so sorry we couldn't have you here. And of course, we had planned to do that last spring, and we know all know what happened last spring. But do be the good evangelist for small liberal arts colleges.
Absolutely.
We really appreciate that.
It's weird that, for the students who are watching, just remember, and this is why I am so adamant in my evangelizing about this, but it is, I think, you all are going into a world that is changing minute by minute. And the most important skill set you can bring to the work world is, an ability to think analytically, to write well, to speak in ways that help bring understanding to people, to be able to move with the times and adjust on the fly. And I think that's why this kind of education, where you're really, forcing you to think critically all the time, is going to prepare you really well for a world that, well, we didn't know. We were, even this world, sure. We had no idea we were going to be living in.
So well said, Amy. Thank you very much. Well, here we are just a little over a week away from presidential election day. Most poll indications are that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are in the lead in this presidential campaign. It would seem that it's their election to lose. The lead in the Real Clear Politics national average is a little under 8 points, at least when I checked earlier today. Most important for the all-determining Electoral College, Biden-Harris seem either to have pretty healthy leads or are highly competitive in the so-called battleground or swing states, including our own state of Minnesota. Most agree that Trump-Pence would have to win a good number of these states to win the election. So everything would seem to point to a Democratic presidential victory. But we've heard something like this before in 2016, when it was generally expected that Hillary Clinton would defeat Donald Trump. Of course, that didn't happen. Trump won. Amy, what's different this time around? Or are there reasons to think that Trump, who always seems to be able to surprise, could surprise this time again?
Right. Such a great question. And, you know, if you look back at mid-October of 2016, Hillary Clinton was leading in the NBC Wall Street Journal poll by 11 points. And the mid-October NBC Wall Street Journal poll that came out the other day had Joe Biden up by 11 points. So seeing those side by side, you think, well, why should we feel that the 2020 race is going to end any differently than 2016? You know, part of the challenge it's not just in doing the job that I do and the team at the Cook Political Report and other folks who are analysts and reporters, but, you know, folks in any profession or in any business, you know, you have to do this balancing act constantly of using your past experience as a guide to help you navigate, you know, the future. Okay, I've been through this before. I've seen this before. I know what the final outcome is going to be, or I know how to react or what we do in a situation like this. We've been here before. But, you know, 2016 was a situation that we hadn't been in before. We'd never seen a candidate like Donald Trump. We never thought that somebody who could come from so far outside of the political establishment, mainstream, et cetera, could make it through a primary, nonetheless, through a general election. And so it is the sort of the scarring of that for many people, right? That there's a lot of talk around Washington about political PTSD, people now believing, as you said, Ed, that, you know, this is a candidate who has sort of magical power, that political gravity doesn't work on him. He can rise above all of the normal rules. But if we've seen anything over the last 4 years, it's that actually he's ruled by the same set of rules the rest of us have to follow in terms of politics and the consequences. And so I think we saw this pretty clearly, for example, in the midterm elections, where Republicans had a particularly bad night especially at the House level, losing 40 seats in that election, which is quite a remarkable number, given how good things were on the surface, right? You had a decent to good economy. Yeah. Nothing bad was happening. We obviously didn't have a pandemic at that moment. So it was pretty clear that the association with Donald Trump was going to be a problem for Republicans, and that he himself, the president himself, his polarizing way of governing had political consequences. So let's go back to where we were when we're talking about where we were then, and that poll. And I think it's really important to walk through some differences. In the middle of 2016, or the middle of October in 2016, when that poll showed Hillary Clinton up 11 points, she was actually the candidate who was the status quo. It was Donald Trump who was the challenger. He was the guy who was going to shake things up. He was the change candidate in a year that definitely was a change election. People were excited about the idea of something new or somebody new, and that's not unusual. after 8 years of one party in power, the other party usually wins by saying they've had their chance, they've done their time, now it's time to give another party a chance. So it was a change year. He was the change candidate. She was the status quo. Now he is the incumbent president, and he's being judged as an incumbent president, not as a challenger. His overall approval rating right now sits at 43%, which is historically low for a president hoping to get a second term. We've never had a president reelected who is this close to election with an approval rating this low, going back to George W. Bush, Barack Obama. They had approval ratings somewhere around 48 to 50% at this point. Two incumbent presidents who lost re-election, George H.W. Bush and Jimmy Carter, had approval ratings that were a little bit lower. Jimmy Carter was at about 37%, George H.W. Bush somewhere around that same number. So he's doing a little bit better than they are, but much worse than where the successful first-term presidents were. So he's being judged as president, and that number is not good. So 43% approve, 54% disapprove. The other thing that's different, besides the fact that he's the incumbent now, is that his opponent isn't Hillary Clinton. In that poll that had Hillary Clinton up by 11 points, her overall unfavorable rating, the people who thought that they just said, I don't think favorably of her, was 11 points higher than where Joe Biden is right now. Joe Biden has an overall positive favorable rating. Now, to be fair, Donald Trump's overall favorable rating also looks better than it was in 2016, in part because he's really mobilized, or consolidated is a better way to say it, consolidated the Republican support that he didn't have in 2016. So Joe Biden, much more popular, harder to demonize, and harder to make sort of a scary alternative. The third big difference is that there are very few voters who haven't made up their mind. Back in 2016, in fact, I looked at the last NBC Wall Street Journal poll that came out right before the election, and only 84% of voters were picking either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. So there were 16% of voters saying they were going to vote third party, or they were still undecided. This last 2020 poll in October showed 95% of voters had picked either Biden or Trump. I think it's 53-42, something like that was the number where they had that. And what that means is there are fewer people who could swing this election. There's less chance for volatility when so many people have made up their mind, and very few of them say they're going to vote for a third party candidate. If you remember, in 2016, that third party vote was pretty significant. It was 6 to 7%, either third parties, or they left it blank or wrote in a name. So all of those pieces are gone. And probably the most problematic for the president right now is the fact that the issue in which he is getting his lowest approval ratings, which is handling the coronavirus pandemic, is once again front and center, right? That's what is happening. And these last 5 days of the campaign, we're seeing a spike in cases around the country. Of course, it's hit the president's own staff, the vice president's staff. So that makes it much different than, say, where we were in 2016. The thing that is similar, where the president does have a sort of, or maybe things are better for the president. I said he's got the Republican base with him. That wasn't guaranteed in 2016. There was still a lot of talk that maybe they weren't going to coalesce around him in time. They ultimately did, but this year they are much more solidly behind him. And once again, what he's hoping for is a turnout operation that will swamp whatever the Democrats have been able to put together. But if you look at the numbers in these battleground states, what you find is, while Donald Trump's still doing well with his base, he's lost even more ground with independent voters, suburban voters, women voters, older voters. Just running up the score with his base again is not going to be enough to make up for what he's losing from 2016 or that he never got in 2016.
I see. One thing that came up in 2016 after he won, people started talking about what pollsters had missed, and they talked about the hidden Trump voter, the Trump voter who was embarrassed to admit to a pollster that he or she was going to vote for Trump, or didn't want to say it to the neighbors, I'm going to vote for Trump, or fellow workers, that kind of thing. Is there any way of getting a perspective on that matter? I mean, can you rule out that as a real issue in this time around, or is that something that is out there still?
Yeah, I think we have to come up with a different term, because I don't know that they are shy Trump voters. You know, that was one phrase, and as you pointed out, it implies that there are people who, if called by a pollster, are not going to admit that they like Donald Trump because it is socially unacceptable, right, or they don't want someone in their household to know that, right? But if you've driven around the country, and I'm sure you see this in Minnesota as well, when you get to certain parts of the state, you see lots of Trump flags, right? If you drove up right now, the vice president's up near Duluth. I think it's tonight or tomorrow. I can't remember when he's going up there, but you go up there, I'm sure there are Trump flags and signs and barns painted with Trump, you know, paraphernalia,
sure,
whatever.
Sure.
So they're not shy. It's getting a handle on how many of those folks are going to be turning out, because the mistake that some pollsters made, especially in these battleground states, was they didn't get enough of those types of voters, and demographically they were white voters with a lower level of education. Didn't get enough of those in their sample, didn't wait for those kinds of voters. And so what ended up happening was the polls were much friendlier to Hillary Clinton, because they sort of, they had too many white voters who had a higher level of education and underestimated the number of people in their polls who were white and non-college. Now, those have been compensated for. As I said, in the 2018 election, the polls were pretty spot on about where Democrats were succeeding and where they were falling short, and it fell in many ways along those same sort of fault lines. So I do think that, look, we're going to find out on Tuesday about this voter, but I think it's less about they're hidden because they're embarrassed, and much more about the fact that they're hidden because they're really hard to find. They are living in small town or rural America, in places that are, they are not as easy to reach, number one. And number two, they don't trust pollsters. Even if you were to reach them, they're probably not likely to talk to you, not because they're embarrassed about Trump, but because they don't trust you.
Okay, but is that uncertainty still, I mean, whatever the motivation might be for a Trump voter not being found?
Yeah, is there enough uncertainty out there? Right. Yeah. Everything that I am hearing suggests that while there may be a vote that's out there that hasn't been picked up in the polls, could be a couple to 3 points. So it's significant if there's a polling error of that nature that could move a state or two closer. But as I said, what you have to assume, though, is that it's not just that number's wrong, but that a whole bunch of other things are wrong, that Trump's numbers among independent voters, suburban voters, et cetera, are also off. Yeah. So it is, listen, I will say this. I do think it is one big question mark out there that is absolutely worth noting and keeping an eye out for. But I think it's better to say that this is a vote that is hard to capture rather than it's a shy vote.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. Let's move to the issues now that are driving the campaign. Given the empirical data that you're seeing, and abstracting for the moment from Trump as character, his personality, and that sort of thing, what do you think are finally the issues that are going to determine the outcome of this presidential election? What are you seeing there in the empirical data? And you mentioned the
what's so interesting is...
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, what's remarkable about where we are today is it doesn't look all that much different from where we were in 2018 or the beginning of 2019 or the beginning of 2020, which is the center of the political universe is Donald Trump and your feelings about Donald Trump. You are either voting for Donald Trump or you're voting against Donald Trump. It's not really a Trump versus Biden campaign. Now, I do think that the president's handling of the coronavirus and the centrality of this issue in the campaign has also hurt the president. And what you'll notice if you look at the very beginning of the year, again, I'm using the NBC Wall Street Journal poll. I think it's an excellent poll, but even if we used the average of other polls taken at the very beginning of January, what you would see is the president trailing Joe Biden anywhere from 4 to 6 points. Over the summer, when things were going really badly on COVID, on the George Floyd protests, you saw that number widened to anywhere from 10, 12, 14% gap. It went back down to about 7 or 8 points as we got into early September after the debates, and the president's COVID diagnosis went back up to 10, 12, 13, 14. Now it's coming back, as you said, somewhere around the 8, 9 point range. So if we just bring it from where we were at the beginning of January till now, it went from 4 to 6 to 8 to 9. And that little increase, I think, in the gap was due to the COVID crisis and the president's reaction to that, and also to the protests. I've heard that from a lot of, especially suburban women voters, who are really disappointed in the way the president reacted in those early days of the protest and clearing Lafayette Square and the photo op with the Bible. But fundamentally, opinions about this president are really driving this election, and more so than any issue or policy.
All right. But you do mention his handling of the coronavirus, and then the race protests over the summer, the death of George Floyd. Yeah. That contributed to some negative perceptions of Trump. So to some degree, perceptions of issues are feeding into the assessment of Trump. Absolutely. Here.
Absolutely.
You didn't mention the economy. I mean, that's supposed to be Trump's calling card, right? Or at least before the pandemic, things seemed to be going, at least at a certain level, very well. Is there anything in this moment that he could draw on, or he can be drawing on in his campaign, or is that having any kind of is it being indicated anywhere in the empirical data that that is an attraction for some people to Trump, or is that just lost at this point in the campaign?
So it's a really interesting point, because going all the way back to 2017, the 2018 elections, Republicans in Congress were desperate for the president to talk more about how good the economy was and how the tax cut bill that they'd passed in 2017 was responsible for that. And Republicans wanted to go into that election just talking economy, 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 economy. The president wanted to talk about immigration and the border wall, and you could see it, and the Twitter fights he was getting into with personalities, et cetera. And so there was never this sort of disciplined focus on the economy. And he ended that campaign, if you remember, it was talk about the caravans that were going to come over from Mexico. And of course, then we had the Kavanaugh hearings as well. Those dominated the final weeks, those two issues, the final weeks of the campaign that Republicans really want it to be about the economy. Then we go into 2019 and it was, okay, the economy is looking even better. Of course, the president is going to be able to use this issue to win re-election. But when you looked at the empirical data, and this is what's really fascinating, is that even people who gave the president high marks on his handling of the economy said they didn't like him as president and they weren't voting for him. That wasn't everybody, but there was a significant chunk of voters who were giving him good marks on the economy, bad marks as president, voting for Joe Biden. I can't remember what that final or what the number was. There's something about the number 13% of voters, but you saw this consistently, that he was getting a majority of voters saying, we think you're doing a great job on the economy, but he was never getting a majority of approval of his presidency. In fact, he's the first president in modern American history to never reach 50% job approval rating. He has spent pretty much every single day of his presidency with more people disapproving of the job he's doing than approving. And I think there are a couple of reasons for this. One is, as you pointed out, Ed, it's a lot about who he is and how he comports himself as president. And I think this is especially true. This is why you're seeing that for women voters, you're seeing this even larger gender gap this year. But I also think we've been seeing this polarization on opinions about issues, including the economy, for some time, where voters who are of the party that's in the White House, right? So if you are a Republican, Donald Trump's in the White House, you think the economy is doing well. If your party's out of the White House, you think the economy is doing poorly. And then it flips when the White House flips. And, you look at, for example, in 2016, going into that election, Democrats thought the economy was doing well. Republicans said not so well. By February of 2017, Republicans overwhelmingly said the economy was doing well. Democrats overwhelmingly said it was terrible. Nothing happened, right? Nothing empirically happened to the economy. And so there are people who are actually doing well, right? Financially doing well, who think say, when asked by a pollster, do you think the economy is doing well? No. There are people who aren't doing financially very well. When asked, do you think it's doing well? Of course. Because really what it is, it's a proxy now, like almost everything. It's a proxy for how you feel about the person in the White House, more than your own personal financial situation or your family's situation.
That's fascinating.
And, it's fascinating. And it's been going on for a little while. I mean, it's not totally new. This was happening with Obama too, and George W. Bush, but the degree to it, the tremendous polarization, it just exploded under Trump. And it does make it challenging then, even if a president in a good economy may not be able to that's not going to ensure that he gets really high job approval ratings. If I can just add one thing, I do think that the president, though, even with the challenges he had in getting some of those, I think the economy is doing well, but I don't like him. I think he would have been able to use that in the campaign to make the case for another 4 years, to say, okay, I get it. You don't really like the way I act and the tweeting and all of this stuff, but we've had a pretty good run. Let's keep it going. You don't want to risk that, right? Win over enough voters with that. But even that was not a guarantee. And people's opinion about the president himself, this happened to Barack Obama too. In 2012, I remember the Romney campaign looked at those job approval ratings on the economy and said, well, Barack Obama can't win. People still think the economy is not doing well. They're not giving him good marks on the economy. We're just going to run on the economy, the economy, the economy. Obama won because he turned that around and basically made it about who's looking out for you in this economy. The guy who's the Bain Capital guy, who's all about making money by laying off thousands of people and shipping jobs overseas, or or me. I'm just a nice guy. You like me, and look at Joe Biden. We saved, GM making cars in Detroit, and what I would hear in these focus groups over and over again from voters is this sort of like, it wasn't really Obama's fault. This economy, he inherited it, and Obama came into that election with a higher personal favorable rating, even though his job approval ratings weren't as good. And so we love to think about voting as this very intellectual exercise, right? Voters go and they look at the issues and they point out, well, this is the most important thing to me, and so I'm going to vote in my interest, my self-interest on the environment and economy and immigration. But it's much more emotional than that, right? It is, who do I like? Who do I think can do this job? Who has the leadership skills? Who's going to stand up and fight for X, Y, Z? And that's where the economy, fits in now into that broader question.
That's interesting. What comes to mind here is, I think it was Clinton, Bill Clinton, that is, when he was running for office or while he was president, I can't remember. He's quoted to have said, "It's the economy, stupid." Right. So what I'm hearing you say is that, well, not really. It's
the economy. It can help you. Yeah, listen, you definitely want to run with a good economy, and you don't want to run in a recession. But it in and of itself is.
It's not enough. It's the personality. It's the personality, stupid, or something, something like that. Yeah, it's really interesting. And the idea of charisma has a lot to do with whether or not a person is well situated in an election. That's very interesting. Just one other thing about Trump's campaign and the sorts of kinds of appeals and pitches he's made. He and other Republicans have said that he's reached out to the black community on matters economic in ways that previous Republican administrations haven't, and even he wants to argue now that there's an advance over and against what Democrats are really interested in. And so you have people like Ice Cube, the rapper, coming out in support of Trump, and Kanye West, and there's this sort of black capitalism thing, and it gets connected with certain kind of vision of black masculinity and all this sort of thing. I mean, do you see anything in the empirical evidence that would speak to the issue of whether or not they are making inroads in that way, or is that just Republican propaganda?
No, I think it's a really interesting and very direct strategy, which really goes to the heart of Trump's appeal. Yes, his core base are white voters, white male voters, more specifically, white male voters of a certain age and education level is the core of the core of the core. But it is also a campaign of masculinity, as you said, an appeal to men of all races on this, whether it's, I'm a guy, made my money, I'm going to help you make money. This is, what I hear and talking to folks too in the Latino community, in the African American community. What men will say to them about Trump is, well, I don't like X, Y, and Z, but, I do like that he speaks his mind. He's not, sort of bound by all these silly little, the games that these politicians play. He doesn't act like a politician. He comes from the business world. There's an appeal there. But what you also see on the flip side of that, of course, is how strongly African-American women are aligned now with Democrats. They are the backbone. And you're seeing the Biden campaign running ads with African-American women saying, we are the Democratic Party. We are the reason that Joe Biden will succeed, and we are the core of the Democratic Party. And the Latino community as well, huge gender gap between Latina and the Latino men. And I do think that that's, a driver of it, in the sense that, he's the guy who's going to bring the economy back. He's the guy who, acts like no other person in politics I've seen before. And it's women who are saying, not only do they not like the behavior and the attitude, but they're also the ones who are focused on things like healthcare and the gender gap in terms of wages. And so I think it is fair to say that he is appealing to voters, trying to win as many voters as he can, but that they're appealing to them as men more than as just African Americans.
That's interesting. Yeah. Everybody agrees that as far as the Electoral College is concerned, this election is going to turn on the battleground states. And particularly the ones that Trump won last time. Can he hold on to them? Can he make inroads elsewhere and so forth? I mean, what battleground states are you looking at particularly now? What's the barometer for you? And what do you think is going to be happening in any number of them? We could even start in Minnesota. Because that's
I know, of course, we always got to start in Minnesota.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So what would you say about what we're looking at, particularly with respect to the battleground states now?
So here's the best way that I think to look at this. And first of all, for those of you who are real junkies, you probably already know this, but if you don't, there's a great website called 270 to win. It's the number 270 to win.com. And I like them a lot because they put a map on their website that is interactive, and so you can turn a state blue or red or toss up, and it will calculate the Electoral College score there immediately, so you don't have to add it up in your head. And number one. Number two, they have historical data on there about what maps have looked like. I think they go all the way back to like the 1930s, something like that. So it's a great source of information. Plus, it's a great way to play with the map and not have to add numbers up in your head as you go along. But if you go onto that site and you just take the 2016 map and keep everything else the same, but give Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin to Joe Biden, take them from Trump, give them to Joe Biden, that's it. Joe Biden would win with 278 electoral votes. You don't need to change anything else. No Florida, no Iowa, no Ohio, no North Carolina. That's it. Now, no presidential candidate wants to run with just one path. That is very dangerous. You don't want to do anything in life, right? Talk about all your eggs in one basket. You need to look for as many pathways as possible to 270. And and this is why it's also fascinating watching where the candidates go this last week. You're seeing tomorrow Joe Biden go to Georgia. He doesn't need that state, but that is a state right now that is an absolute toss-up. It's a state that Democrats came very close to winning governor's seat in last time, but came up a little bit short, but that's competitive. Kamala Harris is going to Texas. That's not a state that we've ever talked about in the battleground category before. I still think this is a reach for Democrats, but they're going to come closer this year than ever before. To me, the real key state, at least early on in this process, so maybe a better way to say this is where can which states can each candidate not afford to lose? And for Trump, it is those states like Georgia and Texas, but Florida, North Carolina. It is very hard for me to see President Trump winning re-election if he loses one or both of those states. It's very hard for me to see Joe Biden winning if he doesn't win Pennsylvania. And right now, what we're looking at is an electoral college map where all three, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, have Biden up by a pretty healthy margin, 5 to 7 points, something like that. He's also leading narrowly, but in another former red state that's more purple now, which is Arizona. And then you have Florida, North Carolina, Iowa, all as toss-ups. Ohio's a toss-up, but more tilting to Republicans. And Texas is a toss-up, also tilting Republican. So that's a lot of defense that Donald Trump is playing. And it means that Biden has the luxury of being able to say, well, we can play in all these different states. We don't need to win them all. But heck, the more of them we win, the easier it is for us to say, it's okay if something, we don't have to bank everything on just flipping one state.
Sure. How are you remembering how Biden compares in the battleground states at this time in the election to Clinton this time around?
Yeah, and so what you noticed at this point in the 2016 election was in fact, I think it was maybe this day or a day away. It happened a day or so ago, but the James Comey investigation reopened. And so those last 10 days of the election were consumed by this question about, oh my gosh, what is going on with this reopening of the investigation, and where's this computer, and what is this about? You also started to see the national polls narrowing. As I said, mid-October, Hillary Clinton is up by 11. By the end of October, she's up by 4 nationally. And so it was clear that these states were getting closer. The big difference, and this goes to your point about, what happened in 2016 and all the political PTSD there. What we saw in the national polls was, yes, it was tightening. We were saying it was getting closer. The race was, no longer that Hillary Clinton, this is not the wipeout situation that it looked like earlier in October, but that in places like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, Hillary Clinton's lead still looked pretty good, 5 or 6 points. But as I said, what we now know is that many of those polls didn't take into account that weighting on education, and that there weren't, I think, enough of those polls as we went close into the election to account for all of the movement that was happening. Yeah. And so I think the good news is we're a week out. We're seeing stability. And I say good news in the sense that, nothing is sort of sneaking up on us. If the polls were tightening, then I want to be able to see that. If the polls are not tightening, to be able to see that.
Yeah, you mean good news from the perspective of accurate poll prediction.
Correct.
Yeah, right.
Correct.
Right, okay.
Correct.
Yeah, that's and you're not seeing anything in the empirical data suggesting, say, that the Hunter Biden stuff is emerging in the way that the James Comey stuff impacted Clinton. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. And I think part of the reason that the James Comey stuff mattered was that, well, we'd already spent a year and a half talking about emails and servers and the Clinton Foundation. And Hillary Clinton came into that campaign with already a lot of baggage around not just her, but her husband, their time in the White House, the scandals that enveloped the Clinton White House. So there was already a lot of stuff there. And when the Comey story broke, well, it fit into a narrative that had already been playing out. Sure. Versus one that kind of comes out of nowhere at the very end. And as I said, with Biden so much more popular, he's not, well, maybe a better way of saying this is he's not popular, okay? But he's not unpopular.
Sure, that makes sense. Quickly, the battle for the Senate. What's the likelihood you think that it's going to go Democratic?
It's very good likelihood. It's a strong likelihood. And it's really going to come down to these 5 states. Well, actually, let's make it 6 states. Democrats are on defense, especially on defense in Alabama. And they're likely not going to be able to hold on to that. But Republicans are playing defense in about 9 states. And the most difficult states for them to hold: Colorado, Maine, Arizona, North Carolina, Iowa. So if Democrats lose Alabama, but pick up those 5 seats, then they will have netted a majority. And it's not a big majority, but it is a majority.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, I think now might be a good time for us to shift to general Q&A from our audience. And we do have some questions that have been posed already by St. Olaf students, and we're beginning that now. So could we go to the first question?
Hi there, my name is Maggie Bunsen.
I'm Linnea Cheek.
And we have a question about Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation hearing, as she is expected to be possibly nominated tonight or later this week. Our first question is, how do you think this nomination hearing has impacted the election in the past week or so?
And to follow that up, if the administration were to change after November 3rd, what kind of retaliation could Joe Biden impose? For example, stacking the courts.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Great questions. After the 2018 Kavanaugh hearings, and they also came on the heels of, or not on the heels, they came right before the election. So in the couple of weeks right before the election, you had a really contentious fight over the nomination. And I think both sides would concede that it had an impact in that it generated a lot of enthusiasm for Democrats, especially in those suburban areas who were really frustrated by the process, didn't think that Kavanaugh should have been voted on. He shouldn't have succeeded in getting the votes to be sworn in as a new justice. So it helped. I mean, it was already an enthusiastic Democratic base turnout in 2018, but I think it didn't hurt, and it probably helped to keep some of those, especially those suburban districts, turning blue. But in some of the more rural areas and the redder states like Missouri or Indiana or North Dakota, I think it did help generate more enthusiasm for Republicans. It turned some Republicans out that, maybe weren't that interested in voting in the midterm elections, but when they saw this hearing and how it played out, and they felt as if Democrats were, had wronged Kavanaugh, had slimed him, I think was I don't know if that was the exact word that Lindsey Graham used, but something to that degree. And so they felt like, okay, now I need to go out and vote and tell those Democrats that was not okay, right? Going to get back at Democrats by turning out and voting. But obviously the Coney Barrett hearings didn't have that kind of drama. It was a pretty overall kind of boring, uneventful hearing. And Democrats kind of wanted to keep it sort of boring. They didn't want to give Republicans a reason to get energized about this. They wanted to keep the focus on an issue that they think is helping them across the country, which is healthcare, and it's helping them in all kinds of districts and all kinds of states. And what you're seeing overall is that Amy Coney Barrett goes into her vote, which may or may not have happened at this moment in time, and onto the Supreme Court with pretty decent approval ratings, much higher than, say, where Kavanaugh was at the end of his hearings. But it hasn't changed the vote at all. Opinions about Amy Coney Barrett, especially among independent voters, are overall pretty positive, but that hasn't changed independents' opinions about President Trump or how they're going to vote in the 2020 election. The next question that Linnea had about, how does it play itself out come 2021 if Democrats are in charge of the Senate and Biden is in the White House? And, you've heard a number of senators who normally are kind of low key, like Angus King from Maine, who came out today and said, the way that the Republicans have behaved in the majority for these years, if they think that they can do this and that there's not going to be some payback, they're kind of fooling themselves. We've heard Sheldon Whitehouse, senator from Rhode Island, make some similar allusions to, something's going to happen next year, or don't expect us to play nice when we're in charge because you guys haven't played nice. On the issue of where it goes on so-called packing the court or getting the votes to add justices, I mean, I do think that is something that is going to be talked about a lot in progressive circles, but overall, it's not particularly popular. And so if that does come up and become part of the conversation in a Democratic run Congress and White House, I think you're going to see pushback even from many Democrats, especially Democrats in swing states or districts who say, you know what, this isn't something that we should be doing. This is especially at a time when we're still in the middle of a pandemic, we still have a health crisis, and we still have an economic crisis. This is not what voters want us to spend our time doing. What I do think you can expect, though, is that Democrats are going to look for opportunities to find ways to undermine things like the filibuster or change the filibuster rules to make it easier for them to get things done without having a 60-vote majority. And that things that used to be niceties in the Senate, for example, allowing the home state senator of wherever a judge who's been nominated for a federal court, letting that home state senator do something called a blue slip, basically put a hold on a candidate. Those are going to be gone now. So if you're a Republican senator and a judge comes from your state and you don't want that person to be voted on, too bad. It's going to happen. So those sorts of niceties are going to go away. But I just, maybe I'm wrong, maybe Democrats will go full steam ahead, but I just don't sense that's, you only have so much political capital, especially early on in this process. And I don't think that's where majority of Democrats in Congress are going to want to put it.
Thank you, Amy. Next student question.
My name is Derek Lincoln, and I'm currently a senior majoring in economics. Since the 2016 election, I have noticed the radicalization of the Democratic and Republican parties. In my opinion, is worrisome, mainly because it encourages people to not be tolerant of different perspectives. What are your opinions on the radicalization of our political parties, and do you think anything can be done to change it?
Yeah, Derek, that's a really good question. And I've now been, for years, I looked at things or at options that would change the political sort of rules, right? Like campaign finance reform, or changing the way that people are allowed to register to vote, or trying to think of other things, primaries and things like this that opened up the process and allowed more people into the process. Basically, the theory for years has been that sunshine is the best disinfectant, right? The best way to make our politics open and transparent, and hopefully to make it less toxic, is to have citizens be a part of this process, to not let it be just concentrated in the hands of Washington and or state capital, or just political figures. But in this time we're in right now, I think it's becoming really clear that the issue isn't so much about what's happening with our politics, like changing the rules around politics, as much as it is somehow getting control of the ways in which we as citizens are getting our information. And I think that really the root of so much of this polarization, you have to put not at the feet of, we should have term limits or things like that, or redistricting reform, but really putting it at the feet of social media and cable TV and the sorts of things that encourage polarization. I mean, the algorithms that are there on Facebook and other social media apps are designed expressly to keep you wrapped in a bubble, to keep you from meeting and talking with other people in a civil way, of learning about a different way of thinking. Because once you type in something, right, maybe you believe about some issue, and you type it in and you start reading about it, and then you read a little bit more and they're sending you to these different sites and you keep clicking. And now the algorithm says, oh, well, it looks like you really want to have more information about this. And so it sends you very direct pieces constantly that only serve to like keep your opinion without it keeps you from really ever challenging that opinion. Maybe that's a better way to say that. And so I just think that's the big problem. And I worry that we spend way too much time talking about the other stuff and not enough about how insidious the way we consume information has become, not just to making our politics more toxic, but kind of our entire culture more toxic. So I don't know the answer to that. There are a lot of folks who say the best way to do this is to break up big tech. Maybe that we, in the same way that the FCC had to regulate television, there has to be regulations here, but I don't know how that works. Hopefully there are smarter people than I am out there who can help us to navigate this. And I do think that it is going to be your generation, the generation that grew up in this virtual world that knows of nothing before we had internet, to help make it work better.
There's another argument here, I suppose, for liberal arts education and bringing people together who have different perspectives and engaging each other in a kind of civil, interactive way.
All right, but that's not the incentive structure right now.
Sure.
There's no incentive to do that. Yeah.
Next student question.
With just 8 days until the election, what do you think is the most effective strategy that politicians use to appeal to the parts of the electorate that they typically aren't as strong with? How are Biden and Trump employing these tactics in this final stretch of the election?
So it's a really good question, because what we're seeing right now is the two candidates kind of taking a different approach in these last days about who they see as the most important voters in this election and in the electorate. As I said, what you were seeing from Biden is, a campaign that, yes, is making sure to vote, to go and show up in all of those places that are critical to the 270 electoral college votes, especially Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan. They don't want to get caught in that same, but Hillary didn't show up trap, right? Being accused of taking those states for granted. But they're also going and speaking with voters in non-traditional swing states like Georgia and Texas and Iowa. At least in 2016, Iowa wasn't supposed to be, 2020, earlier in the year, it wasn't supposed to be very competitive. So their message seems to be, look, we're not taking anything for granted, but we also know that we can go and try to bring into the fold people who didn't vote for Democrats last time, right? That should really be your goal in the last few days, is this balance between turning out your base, motivating the people who already like you, making sure that they know how important it is and their vote, it really matters, and also reaching out to the people who haven't yet made up their mind and going to places that, again, traditionally, maybe your party hasn't gone to or used to go to, but said, well, we don't need to go there anymore. Or they don't like us anymore. Or they're never going to vote for us anymore. Or they're brand new. They used to vote, and this is where the suburbs have become this fascinating battleground, right? Wasn't that long ago that there's no way a Democrat would set foot in and around Dallas or Houston around election time. They voted Republican. But in 2018, those districts went to Democrats, and Democrats are doing really well in suburban districts all through the state, out in Plano, Texas, Houston, San Antonio. And, these are the kinds of voters that Democrats not only need to win in this election, but hold on to if they want to hold on to these kind of congressional districts. The president's making a different calculation. He's spending most of his time in and around the small towns and the white working class areas that he did do very well in the 2016 election, and spending most of his time now talking to his base, but not as much time talking to those swing voters. He's not in suburban America. He's not in going into places where he's talking to new kinds of voters, or trying to expand into these undecided voters. Instead, the calculation is we can swamp. It's where we started the conversation, where Ed and I started this conversation, which is that there are these voters out there. I'm not going to call them shy Trump voters. They're hard to find for pollsters to find Trump voters that are out there. They may not be normally politically engaged. Maybe they didn't even vote in 2016, but we got to make sure that they know how important they are and swamp the polls on election day with these voters. But that is a trickier proposition, especially, as I said, when Joe Biden is doing better than Hillary Clinton did among the kinds of voters that Trump won last time.
Thank you, Amy. Next student question.
Hello, Ms. Walter. Thank you for speaking at the Institute for Freedom and Community. My name is Maxwell Rubin. I am a senior political science and Mandarin Chinese major and student associate for the Institute of Freedom and Community. I appreciate and admire the work that you, your colleague Dave Wasserman, and boss Charlie Cook do at the Cook Political Report. Given the decrease of split-ticket voting in American elections, what do you expect to see in closely contested House battlegrounds that were won by President Trump 4 years ago that flipped into Democratic hands in the House, as well as closely contested Senate races such as Maine and Michigan? Thank you.
I will give your regards to Dave Wasserman and Charlie. I'm sure they'll love to hear that. And those are excellent questions, of course. So split ticket voting, as many of you may suspect, is not all that prevalent these days. There was a time when if you were a Senate candidate from a party, let's say you were a Democrat and a Republican won your state, you could still win because voters were making this distinction between the kind of person they wanted in the White House, but if they liked the person that was representing them in Congress, they wanted to continue that. And for many, and this is Susan Collins, for example, in Maine, is talking about this a lot, which is, her longevity is an asset, right? The more tenure you have in Congress, the higher up the ladder you get to go in terms of leadership, and the more you can bring back to your state or district. I mean, that was not that long ago, poli-sci 101, right? All politics is local. You deliver for your constituents, they're going to reward you. It doesn't matter what they think about the person sitting in the White House. You're going to be able to separate. You have a distinct identity. It doesn't work that way anymore. In fact, when the Pew Research just came out this week with some great new data, and found that since 2012, 88% of the Senate races that have been held have gone to the same party that won that state at the presidential level. So very small number of people in Congress right now in the Senate who represent a district represent a state carried by the other party. They also found that only 4% of voters this year in those battleground states said that they were thinking about voting for presidential candidate of one party and Senate candidate of another party, 4%. What that means is that if you are one of those incumbents running in a state that the other party is going to win, you have to hope that they win it by less than 4%. So you do have that window maybe to overcome it, right? You have a 4% cushion theoretically that you can overcome. But that's still tough to do. And I think especially this year, because as we discussed in the very beginning, this is an election that is as much about Donald Trump as anything else. That your opinions of Donald Trump are coloring your opinion of folks up and down the ballot. And to your question about those battleground House districts, we're seeing the same thing. That in suburban districts where Trump was already starting to lose some appeal in 2018, that has gotten worse for him. And it is bringing down many Republicans who, again, have been serving without, these are not folks who had any other problems. They were considered pretty safe because their districts were, in some cases, drawn to be Republican. But as we're seeing the deterioration of Republican support in the suburbs, those traditional suburban districts have become now not so safe. And Democrats are going to hold a significant number of suburban districts in this next election, including districts that Trump carried in 2016, but won't carry this time.
Thank you, Amy. Next student question.
Hi, Ms. Walter. Thank you for taking the time to speak to St. Olaf. I have a question regarding the presidential debates. In light of the recent debates and the polarization of American politics, do you think the debates still have value, whether as a means of informing voters, debating policies, or some other metric? Additionally, what, if any, reforms do you think should be introduced to the debate structure in order to increase their value? Thank you.
Another good question, and the first answer, I think, to this debate question in terms of reform is that they should be done earlier in the year. Now, not in the summer, obviously, you have conventions and the nomination fights may still be going on, but certainly sometime in September, maybe earlier in September, because as we saw this year, and maybe in a non-pandemic year, it will change, but we're seeing record number of voters vote early. I mean, we are still a week away from the election. I think we have more than 65 million people who have already voted. And my guess is even in a non-pandemic year, more people are going to choose to vote by mail or vote early. And so debates then need to happen before those ballots are sent out. The second debate we had on October, what was that, 22nd, right? The second debate was the latest debate that they've had in sort of our modern era. And again, not only was it late, but it was even later given how many people had already voted. So I think that would be really important. I don't know that voters need to have 3 debates. I think that, again, it was during a time when there was worry that, you needed different kinds of formats and different agendas and different topics to really drill down on and focus on, and have a town hall one where voters get a chance to ask the candidates specific questions. And look, if you've been watching politics for the last 10 years, what you'll notice is that candidates are now doing this on their own, or the cable networks have created these sort of town hall kind of events that, voters get a chance to see the candidates perform in. Now, seeing them side by side at one of these is something different and important, but I don't know that we need as many of those going forward. But fundamentally, I do think that the debate this year had a big impact on opinions of the president, and it put him in a hole that he had to spend much of October digging out of. And it wasn't his answers. It wasn't that he said something at the debate about a policy that was as problematic as the way he performed and his answers to the question about white supremacist group. I think that cemented for many people their opinion of the president, who they were thinking, gosh, I don't know about his temperament and the way he comports himself. And he just seems to, want to just, even if there's only a little bit of an ember burning, he wants to create a fire all the time. I think that really did hurt him. But I think it also turned off a lot of voters who did expect to see a debate where voters were going to be able to hear from the candidates themselves their policies and their opinions on really big issues. So it's a long way of saying, I do think the debates matter. I don't think they should be held as late in the year. I think they should be held a little bit earlier. And I think that maybe you have just two of them rather than three and trying to space them out.
Thank you, Amy. Now a question from a St. Olaf College professor of political science.
Hello, my name is Doug Casson, and I teach in the political science department. First, I'd like to thank you for your insights this evening and for your career of journalistic integrity. My question is about the rule of law. Many Americans are not convinced that people in power are really held accountable for criminal wrongdoing. What chances do you think that the president, if he's not reelected, will face criminal prosecution? And also, what do you think of the precedent of such prosecutions?
It's really interesting that you raised this, because I was interviewing two folks who wrote a book recently about this very issue, and whose names now are totally escaping me. I know Bob Bauer is one of them, who worked in the Obama White House. His co-author worked in the Bush White House. And both of them writing on this very issue about what can be done, really in many ways, to sort of rein in the presidency in the next how many years going forward. And one of the things they disagreed on was the question of prosecuting a president, and whether, for example, the next administration could open investigation into a president, right? So the Justice Department, after Trump leaves, opening investigations into Trump and being able to prosecute him and not being able to pardon the president, things like that. So there was sort of a robust but very civil disagreement between those two going forward. Look, I think fundamentally we know that the courts in New York are likely to have Trump cases on the docket. We know that his son has already been subpoenaed and has testified in, and we know the Southern District of New York is looking into issues that involve the president's business and his behavior before he was president, not necessarily, I don't think anything that happened while he was president. And so going back to that conversation that I had with the two folks who've worked in legal counsel for two different White House, one for Republican, one for Democrat. What the Democrat would argue is, of course, if you broke laws while you were president of the United States, you should be prosecuted for those. And that's the rule of law, and that's how it should work. And the person who worked for the Bush White House saying, of course, that makes a whole lot of sense. But the damage done in the process, the way it would repolarize and refracture the country, and especially on the issue here, which is basically with President Trump, which is the issue of obstruction of justice, is a tough case to prosecute. And if it's not as clean and cut and easy to prosecute, it doesn't make much sense to just put the country through this. The other question, of course, is that the rule of law is supposed to be, in the Constitution, determined by Congress, right? You impeach a president who's broken the law. But we now have a process in Congress where impeachment can happen, but in the House, but getting it through the Senate is a whole different challenge. So we kind of start this conversation. I feel like I've gone all the way around in a big circle, but where we've been this entire time, which is an incredibly polarized country, believing that, one, the impeachment process itself is strong enough. That's a big question mark. And two, prosecuting a president after he's left office for things that he did while he's in office, unless the case is solid, and even if it is solid, will once again re-inflame tensions. We're kind of left with the question of, well, where do we go from here, right? Do we just have each party seeking revenge on the party that came before it? Where does this stop? And it feels sort of hopeless, and it also feels a little bit scary, right? Like, this is the kind of stuff that happens in other countries. This isn't in the US, that, we're all about the peaceful transfer of power, about these norms that are followed by each party time after time after time. We're living in a different era right now. It's just going to be fascinating to see in the post-Trump era how much of this stays and how much of it actually goes when he's no longer in office.
Thank you, Amy. Now we're going to take some questions that we've received online in real time. This from Ingrid from St. Paul, Minnesota. Can you talk a little about the college vote? Is there any evidence that it will be more significant during this election cycle than previous ones?
So it's a really interesting question, and it's something I've been asking, especially members of Congress who represent big college towns. So Lansing, Michigan, or Champaign-Urbana. Not to say that Northfield isn't a big college town, it's a great college town, but where you have, or Madison, Wisconsin, right, where you have thousands and thousands of students who, again, in a normal election, we would see activism happening on campus. In states like Minnesota and Wisconsin, which have same-day registration, you would see, all the work going into making sure that students knew that and setting up polling places around campus. That's obviously not happening. And so the question is, will student participation be as strong in this election if students either A, aren't on campus, or B, they are on campus, but you can't do the sort of organizing you would normally do. Harvard Institute of Politics has been doing survey work on young voters. Now, they're not just college voters, but 18 to 24-year-olds. They've been doing this research for years. I just got their survey just came out. It was either last night or this morning, so I'm sorry I haven't read all of it. I just saw the top line takeaway, which was this is an incredibly motivated group of people, these 18 to 24-year-olds. And in fact, I think the headline was something like these voters more interested, motivated to vote than at any point in the 20 years that they've been surveying this age cohort. So, that suggests that regardless of where these students are, whether they are on campus or not, whether they are students or not, that they're going to be engaged in voting. And so we'll see. Look, I think the big picture is turnout is, from everything that we're seeing now in the early vote to what we've been seeing in polling for these last few months, is an incredible engagement, and intense and interest and intensity surrounding voting, that we're likely to get record turnout. And that's going to be, that's going to mean that it's coming from all quarters, not just from young people. And what it may be at the very end of the day, if everybody turns out, right, if you get big turnout that is among older voters, younger voters, et cetera, it may mean that the percent of the vote that comes from younger voters is not that much different. They don't make up a larger share of the electorate because the entire electorate got bigger. But they may. This may be the year that, those voters really threw their weight around, because remember, millennials now are a bigger cohort than baby boomers. And at some point when those Gen Zs and millennials, they all become of voting age, they are an incredibly powerful generation in terms of their numbers and influence.
Thank you, Amy. This from Larry Ottoman, class of 1974, from Ames, Iowa. Has the press been too easy on Biden regarding his son, Hunter, and foreign entanglements?
I don't know if any of you read this, but there was a great piece in the New York Times by Ben Smith, who's the new media critic in the New York Times, and he took a look at this story, how it came to be, and why it is that news organizations hadn't necessarily been on top, been covering this in the same way that, say, the New York Post or Fox News or some of the other outlets, conservative outlets, had been covering it. One reason was that, at least that we all learned initially before this column, was that Rudy Giuliani gave this information to one outlet, to the New York Post, didn't share it with any other news outlets, wasn't giving any of these news outlets access to these emails and other things for them to verify them, right? So it's hard to ask a news organization to go and ask questions about a topic that they don't have access to the information. The second thing that we learned from this New York Times column was that the folks in Trump world did give information about a Hunter Biden associate who they said told them that Joe Biden knew about these deals, tried to get in on these deals that Hunter Biden was making in China. And basically Hunter was trading in on his family name to the benefit of himself and also to Joe Biden. And the Wall Street Journal went and dug into this story and came out with a verdict, which is there's really not any evidence that Joe Biden profited from whatever his son was or wasn't doing and this business partner was or wasn't doing. And so the story, while it may look salacious, nobody has been able to find the actual, there's not been any there. We also know that the Senate has spent, Republican Senate, has spent a lot of time digging into questions about whether Joe Biden's time in the White House was influenced by Hunter Biden's time on this Ukrainian energy company board. And, what they found was there wasn't evidence to point to that this impacted policy. It didn't look great. This was certainly something that you don't want to say was, oh gosh, I'm trying to find the word. I just lost my train of thought, but didn't look good. But just because it didn't look good didn't mean that there was no evidence that anything had happened there. So we're kind of back to square one here, which is there are allegations. A lot of them have been looked into. There's been no corroborating evidence. Here we are.
Thank you. This from Tracy O'Neill from Northfield, Minnesota. Why isn't Joe Biden polling better with Hispanic voters than Hillary Clinton? If that's the case, I presume that is.
It is. So we've been seeing these numbers now for some time that suggest that I guess there are two ways to look at it. Either Joe Biden isn't doing as well with Latino voters, or Donald Trump's doing better with Latino voters than he did in 2016. And one of the places where we're seeing that, especially today, is in Texas. The New York Times came out with new polling in Texas today that showed Joe Biden not doing as well with Latino voters, and Donald Trump doing especially well with men in the Latino community. Now, part of the challenge in polling the Latino community, especially Texas, is that there aren't a lot of folks who've been doing work in Texas for that long. You think about people who are in this business who have been involved in presidential politics. They know everything about Iowa. They know everything about Pennsylvania. They know everything about New Hampshire because we're there all the time. There are races that are competitive in those states all the time. Texas, until last year's or 2018's Senate race between Ted Cruz and Beto O'Rourke, had been, not a place with a lot of competitive races. So there's not a lot of history of polling there. It's expensive to do there. And it's especially expensive to get the right sample. We talked about missing white voters with lower levels of education in the 2016 campaign. That's a harder group to find even now. But a lot of work has gone into trying to get those voters. Finding a representative Hispanic sample is also challenging and costs a lot of money and is not easy to do. And again, in a state that's not as polled. So we may find out that is true, that is truly the case, because it's been coming up in enough states. There's been enough talk about it that from Democrats and Republicans that suggests that there's something there. But it also may be the case that where in 2016 we missed out on the white voters, this may be the election where we missed out on Hispanic voters.
Well, I think we are come now to the end of our time. Thanks to the audience for joining us tonight in this stimulating exchange with Amy Walter, national editor of the Cook Political Report and host of WNYC's The Takeaway Fridays, heard on NPR news stations. And thank you, Amy, for being with us and for sharing your very special insights and general wisdom about the state of the presidential election.
Thanks a lot. It was great to be with you all.
The St. Olaf Institute for Freedom and Community has scheduled this fall 2 more virtual public events. Tomorrow night at 7 p.m., we'll have with us the controversial intellectual Carlos Ayer, Yale professor, Cuban exile, memoirist, vigorous critic of the Marxist regime in Cuba, and supporter of President Trump's reintroduction of sanctions against Cuba in response to continued political repression there. Oliver's books are banned in Cuba, where he has been declared an enemy of the state, a distinction he says he regards as the highest of all honors. That is tomorrow night. On November 10th, we will host Michael Osterholm, Director of the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy at the University of Minnesota. He will address public policy and COVID-19. Learn more about these events at institute.stolaf, that is S-T-O-L-A-F, institute.stolaf.edu. We hope you can join us. For now, good night, be safe, and be well.